Perfect. So we are ready to start. After a few minutes of delay, thank you very much for your patience. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here, both in person and online. It is a real pleasure to welcome you all to this workshop. Very informal, but I'm sure it will be a very productive afternoon. The workshop is titled Ludwik Fleck in Discussion. The idea behind today's event is quite simple, actually, is to bring Fleck back into active philosophical discussion. Not only, I said, bring Fleck back to the table, back to the discussion, not only as a historical figure, but as a resource for thinking about current issues in the philosophy of science. In particular, we want to explore how his notions of thought collectives and styles of thinking can help us better understand the plurality of scientific practices and forms of reasoning. And this connects with some of the topic of the project SCIPLU, Scientific Pluralism, which aims to develop this idea of stylistic pluralism, but we will maybe discuss more about this later. So without further ado, let me just introduce the first speaker. And I want also to remind everyone that the format is very informal, meaning that we'll have perhaps 30 minutes presentation for each of the speakers, and then each of the presentation will be followed by 10 to 15 minutes individual Q&A. And all speakers are eager to have comments and feedbacks from you, both here in the room and online. And we have Klaus Zittel, and perhaps we will be joined later also by Pietro Model, who are we are very welcome. We are very happy to have with us and to hear their comments and thoughts. So, but again, in a very informal way. After each of the talks, or maybe in the general discussion that we thought of having at the end of the session, we can freely discuss. Okay, so let's get things started with Guillermo. Guillermo Címbora is a PhD student in the Department of Logic and Philosophy of Science at the University of Seville. His doctoral thesis, supervised by Professor José Ferreiro, seeks to analyze how various historicist philosophical projects relate to the problem of realism in the philosophy of science. He has just published the paper Ludwik Fleck, Philosophy of Scientific Practice, on the Journal for General Philosophy of Science. And his talk today is Reconsidering Fleck's Epistemology from Sociological Reductionism to Pluralistic Historicism. Guillermo, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matteo. Good afternoon, everyone. And many thanks to Matteo Vagelli for inviting me to participate in this workshop, surrounded by Fleck experts who know his work far better than I do. The title of my talk suggests a defense of Fleck against the threat of sociologism. However, after knowing who was participating in the workshop, I realized that this defense was perhaps unnecessary. So I have modified the content of my presentation slightly. That my goal now is to defend Fleck against the charge of being a radical constructivist, which we might infer from some of Haken's comments. Or to put it in another way, I would like to argue that Haken's and Fleck's positions are fundamentally identical. To do so, I will draw primarily on the book The Social Construction of What, but unlike Professor Hagen's work, I will not focus on degrees of commitment to social constructivism, but rather on the sticking point of the realist constructivist debate regarding the natural science. Okay. In The Social Construction of What, Ian Haken describes the debate between constructivists and realists regarding the natural sciences and highlights three sticking points that divide the two sides: the problem of nominalism, the problem of the contingency of scientific results, and the problem of explaining the stability of scientific results. The nominalism-realism debate is a classic debate in the history of philosophy. Philosophers who adopt a realist position consider that nature possesses a structure that we seek to describe. Nominalists, on the other hand, consider that nature lacks such a structure. The structure belongs to our representations, and the constraints scientists encounter in constructing this structure do not stem from nature itself, but from our goal in producing this representation, which is none other than to have the capacity to interact with the material world. The problem of contingency, however, is more recent and arises from the following question. The question is the following, I quote. My question is a more complex condition, something like this. If we were to be successful in science, such as cosmology or cell biology, with something like our current interests, will we have to arrive or to pass through something roughly equivalent to our present cosmology or cell biology? End of quote. Here, philosophers who hold a realist position, as well as most scientists, according to Hacking, believe that any alternative scientific inquiry will arrive at the same results as those achieved in our present science, or at least at equivalent results. Meanwhile, the constructionists maintain a contingency thesis. In the case of physics, for example, a theoretical experimental material could have developed in, for example, a non-quarky way, and by the detailed standards that would have evolved with this alternative physics, could have been as successful as present physics has been by its detailed standards. Moreover, there is no sense in which this imagined alternative physics will be equivalent to present physics. That's the idea of Pickering's work. And regarding the explanations of stability, which is the last sticking point, this point comes from the following question. How does a scientific idea or fact become part of the body of scientific knowledge? Constructivists, according to Hacking, typically propose an externalist explanation, which substantially involves social factors, interest, negotiations. Meanwhile, realist authors adopt internalist explanations, and although they may acknowledge that a context of discovery exists, they consider that the discoveries that become part of science are justified by proof and evidence. To complete this analytical framework, we must note that for Hacking, adopting a constructivist position regarding one of the sticking points does not imply adopting a constructivist position on the others. One can adopt, for example, a nominalist metaphysics and yet reject any external explanation of scientific development. Point, I believe. Furthermore, Hacking does not present positions regarding the various sticking points in a dichotomous manner, but rather allows for a spectrum of positions ranging from 1 to 5, with 1 representing the realist extreme and 5 the constructivist extreme. The most extreme constructivist position, which he attributes to Pickering and Latour, would then be 5-5-5. The question we ask ourselves today then is, what is Fleck's position and what is Hacking's position? To answer this question, let's take a brief look at Fleck's philosophy. Okay, Fleck argued that the official image of science and its actual practice are as different from one another as the theory of democracy and its practice. In the most constructive and least critical part of his work, we find both a description of how the actual practice of science works and an explanation of how and why this official image of science arises. Stretching the distinction a little bit, we could classify the many topics Fleck addresses according to whether they seek to characterize the actual practice or the official image. So we could distinguish, for example, some topics on the actual practice of science, like cognition as a creative act, the importance of education, observation is always a highlight, the importance of the second aspect of cognition, and so on, and respecting the official image of science, the theory of esoteric and exoteric circles, distinction between scientific literary genders, apoliticity as an effect of exoterization, etc. So, the concept of thought style and thought collectives are not included in this list of topics because I intend to present them. All of these topics are part of the theory of thought styles and thought collectives. Due to time constraints, I will barely touch on any of the topics related to the official image of science, which I believe Professor Filiska will discuss in her talk, and we'll only mention Fleck's important concept of socialization at the end if I have some time. So, as is often noted, Fleck was a pioneer in applying the sociology of knowledge to the natural science. Influenced by Comte's evolutionism or simply by a more or less spontaneous ethnocentrism, earlier anthropologists and sociologists of knowledge believed that our present-day scientific opinions are in complete contrast with all other ways of thinking, quote, such that modern scientists find themselves in possession of correct thinking and correct observation, once they have abandoned superstition and mystical thought. In line with this conception, traditional epistemology has treated the subject of knowledge as a general, abstract, and immutable subject, who passively registers the data observed by the senses and then logically organize them into concepts, generalization, and theories. Fleck opposed all of this. First of all, for Fleck, scientific research is a creative act. As he states on the crisis of reality, cognition is neither passive contemplation nor the acquisition of the only possible insight into something given. It is an active, living interrelationship, reshaping and being reshaped, in short, an act of creation. This creation is not the product of an abstract and universal subject, but of many different collective subjects or thought collectives. The history of this thought collective, their reshaping and being reshaped, conditions the knowledge that is created, since the sequence of the acts of cognition, as Fleck put it, determines the means, both symbolic and material, and the questions for future research. With these questions and these preconditions, scientists interact with material world, looking for signs of resistance from it. This line of thought leads Fleck to a triadic notion of cognition. Cognition, therefore, means primarily to ascertain those results which must follow given certain preconditions. The preconditions correspond to active linkage and constitute that portion of cognition belonging to the collective. The constraint results correspond to passive linkage and constitute that which is experienced as objective reality, and the act of ascertaining is the contribution of the individual. Passive connections point to material reality and are not explicable in terms either of psychology, both individual and collective, or of history. For this very reason, says Fleck, these seem to be real, objective, and true relations. Thus, for example, the existence of a generic disease called cancer and the use of mercury to treat it can be explained socio-historically as active element of cognition. But the effectiveness of mercury treatment does not depend on history or social psychology. Rather, it is a passive connection. The same applies, for example, to the use of alcohol in the preparation of biological extracts. It is an active connection, and its current utility, which is a passive connection. Fleck asserts that passive relations cannot be explained by history and psychology, rather than saying that they are independent, because these passive relations cannot be expressed except through active elements. And the existence of these active elements, rather than others, which might give rise to another passive relation, cannot be understood except in socio-historical terms. That is why we say that syphilis as such does not exist. This is perfectly expressed in the following definition of a scientific fact. So, the idea of active linkage, passive linkage, and the act of ascertaining, which are related to the collective contribution, the objective reality, and the individual contribution, which is very related to the concept, the phenomenology of Fleck, the concept of observation, which we will not discuss today. But I was commenting on the definition of a scientific fact. For the time being, we can define a scientific fact as a thought-stylized conceptual relation which can be investigated from the point of view of history and from that of psychology, both individual and collective, but which cannot be substantively reconstructed in toto simply from this point of view. This expresses the inseparable relation between active and passive parts of knowledge, as well as the phenomenon that the number of both these parts of knowledge increase with the number of facts. The distinction between active and passive elements allows Fleck to construct a conception of truth that does not depend on a correspondence theory, that is not relativistic in the popular sense of the word, and that is certainly not subjectivist. And Fleck said, but while it lasted, only one solution to any given problem conformed to that style. Such a stylized solution, and there is always only one, is called truth. Truth is not relative and certainly not subjective in the popular sense of the word. It is always, or almost always, completely determined within a thought style. One can never say that the same thought is true for A and false for B. If A and B belong to the same thought collective, the thought will be either true or false for both, but if they belong to different thought collectives, it will just not be the same thought. Truth is not a convention, but rather one in historical perspective, an event in the history of thought, and two, in its contemporary context, a stylized thought constraint. Well, how does the physical image of science emerge from this scientific practice? One of the key aspects of this process is the loss of agency experienced by description of scientific findings as they are transmitted to non-specialized audiences, their exoterization. Again, for reasons of the space, we will only highlight three central elements that Fleck pointed out in this regard. One, retrospective narrative fall into the myth of Julius Caesar. The production of certain literary genres make the agency disappear, and certain values of modern science that the personalization associated with etymology. There is undoubtedly much more to be said about epistemology and metaphysics underlying Fleck's philosophy, but hopefully this is enough to try to situate him within the framework of the three sticking points proposed by Hacking. Let's start with nominalism. Does Fleck hold a nominalist position? On this question, I believe the answer is clearly yes. His repeated rejection of an absolute reality and his conception of cognition as a creative act clearly point in this direction. In fact, Ian Hacking cites him in this work as in the social construction of what as an example of nominalism and state. It is part of Fleck's thesis that scientific fact exists only within a style of thinking, a doctrine to which I am myself sympathetic. Fleck had a different metaphysical picture. He wrote of the emergence and development of scientific facts. He did not mean that they emerged in human consciousness and developed in the history of science. He meant that the world does not come with a unique prepackaged structure. If we want an old name for this metaphysical picture, it is nominalism. As we can see from this quote, Hacking sympathized with this doctrine. And given that he rated himself, Hacking, and Ford on the nominalist scale, which placed him close to the constructivist extreme of the spectrum, we could rate Fleck a 4 or 5 as well. What might we say regarding the explanation of stability? If we find this spectrum in logical positivism, which, while not necessarily realist, offer a completely internal explanation of scientific development and defends a distinction between the context of discovery and that of justification, Fleck clearly leans closer to the constructivist extreme. However, the concept of passive relation and his idea that there is only one solution to a given problem distances him from sociological reductionism and from positions typical of the strong program in sociology. Thus, for example, Fleck doesn't consider the establishment of the Wassermann reaction to be just the result of collective negotiation, but rather the result of a collectivization of the experience and skill needed to establish it. Thus, we could argue that Fleck falls somewhere in the middle, maybe a 3, on this issue. This is the same score Hacking gives himself. Also, he does not provide a detailed explanation as to why. Nevertheless, his theory, I believe, is consistent with his philosophy. But the most interesting point for me, is that of contingency. If we consider Fleck's conception of scientific cognition as a creative activity, in addition to his comments on possible alternative historical developments, the possibility of concepts of elements other than Lavoisier, the possible morphological definition of life, the possibility of medicine without the concept of disease entity, we will have to conclude that Fleck defends a more or less strong contingency position. Hacking, in an unpublished article that Matteo sent to me, it comments in this paper on this matter and assigns Fleck a score of 5 in the contingency spectrum. What is striking, however, is the score Hacking assigns to himself, a 2, and the reasons he gives for that score. They are here. Okay, I said. We may say this, said Hacking. Once a question does make sense, its answer is determinate. That is perhaps the force of the confused internet claim. The answer to questions are the content of the science. Given the questions, the content may be fixed, but what questions will make sense is not predetermined. In my questionnaire at the end of chapter 3, I scored a feeble 2 out of 5 on the side of the contingency of scientific results. That is because I am not a contingentist about the content of science, about the answers of the questions, once the questions are intelligible and are asked. But I am inclined to contingentism about the questions themselves, about the very form of a science. Hacking's idea, as indicated in the excerpt, is that once a scientific research question is formulated, its answer is inevitable and determined by the nature of the work. However, which research questions are pursued is not explained by the nature of the work, but rather requires historical investigation. Throughout chapter 7 of this book, Hacking offers various examples of how a contingent historical situation in which scientific goals are pursued decisively influences the research agenda. Nevertheless, the philosophical relevance of this situation derives not so much from the hardly disputable and unsurprising idea that the scientific agenda, like any other agenda, is determined by sociocultural factors, but rather from a particular way of conceiving the relationship between a research agenda and scientific development and the worldview that emerges from scientific research. Hacking introduces us to the discussion of this relationship through an analogy between a research agenda and choosing a menu at a restaurant. We can order today meat, and this choice will not alter the menu, which will be the same tomorrow, and maybe tomorrow we will choose another, maybe fish or something like that. But he said, I don't quarrel with the menu view, except that it deflects us from the menu itself. It implies that there are all those things out there in the world waiting to be known, and we choose which to know. But is there not the possibility that the very form of the menu may change, and in the case of knowledge, change irrevocably? May not new knowledge determine what are the candidates for future new knowledge, barring others that in other possible human worlds would have been candidates for knowledge? May not a direction of research determine not just the content of our abstract, but the very form of possible knowledge? In romantic but familiar terminology, we may live in different worlds for 2 different reasons. One is material. Our soaring triumph and our poison exhaled by technology equally change the face of the material earth. So we live in a different world thanks to our knowledge. But we may also live in a different world because our conceptions of possibilities are themselves determined by new knowledge, a theme familiar from Thomas Kuhn. In my view, this is precisely the past dependence of scientific knowledge that Fleck defends with his idea of the importance of the sequence of the act of cognition. The idea that once the question is formulated, the answer is determined is equivalent to Fleck's definition of scientific fact and truth we have seen. For all these reasons, I cannot accept that Hacking scores a 2 regarding the contingency of scientific results and Fleck scores 5. I believe that neither Hacking scores a 2 nor Fleck scores a 5, but rather that both fall somewhere in the middle. Also, we shouldn't take the theoretical framework too seriously either, at least without defined criteria for assigning a score, which are lacking in Hacking discussion. But this framework allows me to say that here, Hacking's and Fleck's epistemological and metaphysical positions are, in conclusion, very similar. This is because both begin with a rejection of the correspondence theory of truth and instead propose a kind of historicist a priori. Both also defend historicist positions. Furthermore, both emphasize the disunity of science, distinguishing between different styles of thought, different styles of reasoning, different laboratory sciences. Therefore, we can say that both are pluralist. Both then defend a pluralistic historicism. And as in the after, I said that I will discuss also Kant's philosophy, but I have no time. I will just point out some ideas about which position has Kant respecting with respect to this topic. I think that they share all of these historicist position and pluralistic position with Thomas Kuhn, which is particularly evident in his later writing, the last writing of Thomas Kuhn. Where we can find some differences is maybe in how they explain scientific development, what drives it and its mechanism. In this regard, I would just like to add a final comment. I see in Fleck, as in Kuhn, a development through specialization or even speciation as a metaphor. Kuhn asserted that progress consisted of solving more and more scientific problems. Fleck alludes to the principle of maximum information and of establishing the greatest number of passive connections, which is pretty similar to solving more and more problems, as I understand it. Furthermore, when Fleck comments on the evolution of a concept, whether that of weight or the concept of the Carnot court itself, he always describes it as a process of particularization from general concept to a specific concept for specific purpose. In his last work, he even emphasized the importance of the proliferation of collectives and with it of styles of thought. That is, as we know, implies the proliferation of phenomenological capacities, taking into account the concept of observation in play. So I think that the three authors have a kind of evolutionist conception of scientific progress, which is based in his rejection of a correspondence theory of truth and his pluralism, his increasing pluralism, because it is a thesis of the three authors. I think that we have more and more style of scientific reasoning, thought styles, and different scientific communities and paradigms in terms of Kuhn. And I think that I will take the rest of the time for your questions. So, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much.